אבל כשתאמרו את הנושא.
I apologize for my English, of course, but
it's so bad?
We'll see. But thank you very much for inviting me, and Nama as well for organizing all of this, and it's very good to be here. And I think there are handouts around, and most of the key parts I've tried to bold within the handouts and giving the context, some of the broader context. So, okay, so let's get started. So, in many contemporary scholarly discussions of understandings of war in Rabbinic Judaism, reference is often made to a category of defensive war, or war of self-defense. And scholars who highlight this category generally trace it back to Maimonides' assertion in his Mishnah Torah, whereby, quote, and this is the first on your handout, that a war to deliver Israel from an enemy that attacks them is classed as a commanded war, milchemet mitzvah, alongside wars against the 7 Canaanite nations and against the Amalekites. At the same time, many scholars have noted that Maimonides' notion of a defensive war as a commanded war cannot readily be traced back to any explicit previous rabbinic source. So it's been claimed that this category, defensive war, is not found explicitly in the Talmud or in biblical literature. So the question, part of the question is where does it come from in Maimonides? And so how to characterize Maimonides' stance in connection with previous rabbinic thought. Does he stand in basic conceptual continuity with previous tradition, even though there aren't explicit precedents? Is there a basic conceptual continuity? Or is it possible that Maimonides' stance represents a sharp break from earlier rabbinic conceptuality regarding war and divine authorization? And in the argument that follows, I'll seek to argue that the conceptuality of war in classical rabbinic literature does not appear to contain a category of wars of self-defense which leaders can authorize merely on the basis of their human judgment. To the contrary, an examination of the classical rabbinic text points to a consistent theopolitical understanding in which a direct and immediate authorization from God is required for Israel legitimately to engage in warfare, even in cases of combating an enemy that attacks them. Thus, one key factor for assessing Maimonides' continuity or discontinuity with classical rabbinic conceptuality lies in the question of whether Maimonides thinks that a king of Israel can engage in a defensive war simply on the basis of merely human judgment, or whether he thinks that such a war requires direct divine authorization, either through the medium of prophecy or the priestly oracle of the Urim and Thummim. So we'll first engage in an examination of Maimonides' own writings in order to assess his broader views of authorization via the Urim and Thummim, and whether or not he appears to view this authorization as required for defensive wars. Notably, when we do examine his texts, we find that despite the dominant received scholarly assumptions, it is by no means obvious that he thinks Israel can engage in a commanded war without the need for authorization by the Urim and Thummim. Rather, while his text may not be absolutely explicit in this regard, I argue that based on the available textual evidence, the most plausible construal of his stance is that he treats the Urim and Thummim as equally necessary for commanded war as for permitted war, for both milchemet mitzvah and milchemet reshut. Accordingly, while Nachmanides, who does explicitly state the need for the Urim and Thummim for both categories of war, has often been placed in contrast to Maimonides in this point, it may in fact be the case that Maimonides and Nachmanides are substantively in accord on this matter. So, subsequently, in order to assess the rabbinic traditions that Maimonides himself would have been engaging, we'll then turn to classical rabbinic literature, showing that its conceptual theological framework appears to align squarely with the view that direct divine authorization is needed for Israel legitimately to engage in any warfare, whether milchemet reshut or milchemet mitzvah. A key rabbinic theological axiom in this regard is the notion, which seems to be drawn from engagement with biblical narratives, that God sometimes wishes Israel to fight against its opponents and conquer them militarily, but that at other times God wills that Israel should be defeated and conquered by its opponents. Accordingly, the classical rabbinic framework holds that in order for Israel to align its actions with God's will, direct divine consultation is necessary in order to determine what God's will for Israel is in that particular moment. Thus, they appear to hold that in the absence of positive direct divine authorization, Israel lacks proper authorization and so is to refrain from engaging in warfare, even in cases that could ostensibly be seen as warranting a war of self-defense. The consequence of this analysis indicates that the practical conceptuality of classical rabbinic literature on this topic stands in accord with Nachmanides' stance. If this is the case, we're left with two basic possibilities as to how to understand Maimonides' relation to previous tradition. If one posits that Maimonides does not require the Urim and Tumim for defensive wars, this means that Maimonides may represent a sharp break from the strongly dominant theopolitical stance of classical rabbinic literature. In this regard, Maimonides and Nachmanides would represent two divergent trajectories, with highly significant differences regarding the need for divine authorization in warfare and the role given then to independent human judgment in this regard. However, while this construal of Maimonides remains possible, it does not seem like the most plausible scholarly historical reading of his text. By contrast, if, as I argue, Maimonides also affirms the need for the Urim and Tumim in warfare more generally, including defensive wars, then Maimonides would stand in continuity with classical rabbinic literature, as well as with Nachmanides. If this is the case, then, as far as the tradition of rabbinic Judaism is concerned, the historical roots of war authorized by merely human judgment would lie not in Maimonides himself, and may turn out to be a more modern development that has been incorrectly projected back onto Maimonides by prevalent scholarly consensus. So that's the overall case I'm going to seek to argue. And frankly, my approach here is less, part of it is making the argument from looking at his text, but the other part that I'm still trying to work with is why this hasn't been raised in the scholarship previously. So even regardless of whether it's exactly right or not, I feel there's often been an assumption about this without actually as closely looking at Maimonides' texts. And that's what I'm trying to figure out as well. So hopefully we can look at the text together and then have discussion. So first, Maimonides and Nachmanides. So in assessing whether Maimonides holds that a defensive war as a subcategory of Milchemet Mitzvah can be waged without direct divine authorization, let us first examine his treatment of the matter in his Mishneh Torah. There, in the laws of kings and their wars, he distinguishes between Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut by stating that the king can only engage in the latter if he first obtains the approval of the court of 71. This is the Great Sanhedrin. So this is also on the front page of the handout. By contrast, in the case of Milchemet Mitzvah, the king does not need to seek the permission of the court, Reshut Beit Din, but can go out to war on his own at any time. So Yotzeh Ba'atzmo B'chol Et. So a key interpretive question is how to understand this on his own, Me'atzmo, in this proclamation. On one hand, it clearly means that the king does not need the approval of the Sanhedrin. But does it also mean that he does not need God's direct authorization through the Urim and Tumim? Notably, this chapter of the Mishneh Torah does not mention the Urim and Tumim at all in connection with war, neither with reference to Milchemet Mitzvah, nor with reference to Milchemet Reshut. In other words, Maimonides does not say the Urim and Tumim are required for Milchemet Reshut, but are not required for Milchemet Mitzvah. So he never says that. So one could potentially read the king's permission to go to war on his own as indicating that there's no need for the Urim and Tumim in the case of Milchemet Mitzvah. Conversely, however, one could potentially read the phrase as taking for granted the need for Urim and Tumim for both types of war, and so not needing to mention it explicitly for either one, and instead mentioning only the lack of need of the Sanhedrin's approval, only the factor that differentiates Milchemet Mitzvah from Milchemet Reshut. And so we'll see a little later that actually the Mishnah uses the same phrasing. And so this question of whether a text mentioning points that are points of difference between two categories and not mentioning points that might be the same between them, we'll come back to that. But that's so looking at the text there. Now, as an argument in favor of the idea that Maimonides assumes the need for Urim and Tumim for both types of war, we can note that elsewhere in the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides does mention the Urim and Tumim in connection to war. And so this is the next on your handout. So this is the, in chapter 10 of Hilchot Klei HaMikdash, he states that inquiry was made of the Urim and Tumim by the inquirer asking, should I go up to war or not? The Urim and Tumim would then convey their answer to the officiating priest, who would then pass the result on of either go up or do not go up to the inquirer. Thus, Maimonides clearly associates the Urim and Tumim as employed prior to warfare. Yet, in this discussion, he speaks generally about warfare without specifying any differentiation between Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut. Again, while not conclusive in itself, this generalized discussion would be in keeping with the supposition that he understands the Urim and Tumim as part of the procedure for both categories of warfare. Moreover, in the same chapter here of the Hilchot Klei HaMikdash, Maimonides mentions the priest anointed for battle, the Meshuach Milchama, in connection with the Urim and Tumim. This connection is in keeping with the Talmud's assertion that a key role of the priest anointed for battle is to inquire of the Urim and Tumim in the time of war. With this association in mind, we can when we turn back to the Hilchot Melachim, we can note in chapter 7, so also on page 2 here of your handout, in chapter 7 there, Maimonides asserts that in the case of both Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, it is necessary, prior to engaging in warfare, that the priest anointed for war, the priest should address the arrayed troops. And importantly, in this framework, the priest is also described as one who has been anointed with the oil of anointment, the Shemen HaMishcha. As such, both types of warfare here are marked as specifically sacral, involving priestly sacral elements. And neither can be engaged in without a priestly address. And the priest in question must be one who has been anointed with the special anointing oil. So just already Maimonides' priestly framing of war comes out here, so that from this chapter we see that warfare, even in the case of Milchemet Mitzvah, cannot simply be engaged in by the king on his own, since the role of the anointed priest is also essential in his portrayal. Thus, while not explicitly stated, when we look back again at Hilchot Klei HaMikdash, especially 11 and 12, in which the priest anointed for battle inquires of the Urim and Tumim, alongside this chapter of 7 of Hilchot Melachim, in which the priest anointed for battle is required for Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, it seems plausible to posit that Maimonides would view the priest anointed for battle as engaging in his role of inquiring of the Urim and Tumim in the case of both Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut. In addition, we can also note that in Klei HaMikdash 10:12, Maimonides cites a biblical verse, Numbers 27:21, which is also there, which comes up multiple times throughout classical rabbinic literature as well. So this is, I think, a key verse here in connection with the Urim and Tumim. And this biblical verse, in its original setting, points to the use of the Urim and Tumim, or at least the Urim in the verse, in the wars of Joshua against the 7 nations, in the process of conquering the land of Israel. In designating Joshua as his successor, Moses declares in this verse that Joshua, quote, shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his word they shall go out, yetzu, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, and all the congregation. So Maimonides citing this here is, this is in the context of biblical verses, in the context of Moses having received commandments for warfare directly from God, whereas now in this act of succession, Joshua is designated to receive God's authorization from warfare, both in terms of engagement in battle, going out, and in cessation of battle, coming in. Joshua is to receive this via the Urim and Tumim. So while Joshua's wars, from the later rabbinic perspective, would clearly be instances of Milchemet Mitzvah, they nevertheless require consultation of Urim and Tumim in each instance of battle. not to determine the legal permissibility of the battle, since the conquering of the land has already been designated by God as a required task for Joshua, but rather to determine whether God wills Israel to fight or cease from fighting in that given instance. Since Maimonides himself designates Joshua's war against the 7 nations as a Melchemet Mitzvah, and since he also cites Numbers 27:21 in connection with the Urim and Thummim, it again seems plausible to posit that he would have also linked the Urim and Thummim to this category of war. So to recap, in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides never explicitly links the Urim and Thummim to the category of Melchemet Mitzvah, but he also never links the Urim and Thummim to the category of Melchemet Reshut. Thus, there is nothing in the Mishnah Torah to indicate that he views the Urim and Thummim as required for Melchemet Reshut, but not for Melchemet Mitzvah. Conversely, in other passages, he links the Urim and Thummim to a discussion of war in general. He asserts that the Urim-associated priest anointed for battle is required for both Melchemet Mitzvah and Melchemet Reshut, and he cites Numbers 27:21, which discusses the use of the Urim in the wars of Joshua. So in light of these considerations, the widespread contemporary assumption, scholarly assumption, of that Maimonides' view in the Mishnah Torah as that the Urim and Thummim are not required for Melchemet Mitzvah, this scholarly assumption appears at the very least to be questionable. Moreover, even if we examine Maimonides' less systematically expressed views in his commentary on the Mishnah and his Sefer HaMitzvot, we likewise do not find any assertions that Melchemet Mitzvah does not require the Urim and Thummim. So on the next page here, commenting on Mishnah Sota 8:7, Maimonides, at least in the Ibn Tibon translation, declares the machloket, a debate concerning a war that involves killing those who are killing Israel in order to weaken them so that they do not kill Israel and not war against them on their land. Maimonides views the debate in the Mishnah as a disagreement over whether such a war would be obligatory, chovah, or simply permitted, reshut. Now, this dispute would have implications for whether any Israelites can be exempted from military service in a war. So with we'll come back to this with the Mishnah itself later. So it's about the question of exemption from fighting, being a difference between those two types. But there's no indication that this dispute would have any implications for whether the Urim and Thummim should be used in one type of war versus the other. And similarly, in his commentary on Mishnah Sanhedrin, Maimonides discusses differences between Melchemet Reshut and Melchemet Mitzvah, but does not mention the Urim and Thummim here at all, and certainly does not say that it is a requirement only for the former, but not for the latter. Likewise, in his introduction to his Sefer HaMitzvot, so Shoresh 14, and we'll see there are two slightly different manuscript versions, he states that war, milchama, and the conquest of towns can take place only with the king and with the council of the great Sanhedrin and with the high priest, as it is said, and he shall stand before Eleazar the priest. So again, quoting the verse from Numbers. In this statement, Maimonides talks about war and the conquest of towns generally, without differentiating between Melchemet Mitzvah and Melchemet Reshut. In addition, although this passage does not mention the Urim and Thummim specifically, it does talk about the need for a high priest, and it cites Numbers 27:12, which 21, as we noted above, discusses the use of the Urim with the priest in the wars of Joshua, which are held to be instances of Melchemet Reshut, of Melchemet Mitzvah. And yet, we can say here that it's notable that the inclusions here of the statement, the Council of the Great Sanhedrin, the Atzat Sanhedrin Hagadolah, is somewhat odd. Since the approval of the Sanhedrin seems to be, according to both the Mishnah and the Mishnah Torah, needed only for Melchemet Reshut, it's unclear whether in this passage Maimonides is only talking about Melchemet Reshut, or whether he is asserting the need for consulting the Sanhedrin in all wars. In that first sentence. In the next sentence, Maimonides indicates that any positive and negative commandments that are dependent, quote, dependent on sacrifices, or on temple worship, or on capital punishment, or on a prophet and a king, or on a permitted war, Melchemet Reshut, are applicable only in the period of the temple. Here, it could appear that if Milchemet Reshut is stated as permissible only in the time of the temple, then by implication, Milchemet Mitzvah might be possible without the temple, and by further implication, perhaps without the Urim and Tumim. Yet, as Aaron Soloveitchik points out, this formulation here occurs in the standard printed text, but in the version of Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot, edited by Chaim Heller in 1914, published in 1914, you can see here, the same sentence includes the phrase Milchemet Mitzvah alongside Milchemet Reshut, which would point to the opposite conclusion, namely that both of them require the Urim and Tumim. So there's manuscript variations here. Similarly, when in an article engaging the analysis of Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni, J. David Bleich states about Maimonides that Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot, Shoresh 14, declares that even obligatory wars require consultation and guidance of the Urim and Tumim. So that's in terms of reading the different manuscripts. So in this regard, given the unclear aspects of this text with potentially different versions, and given that the Urim and Tumim are not explicitly mentioned here at all, there is then at the least no clear indication from the Sefer HaMitzvot that Maimonides held the Urim and Tumim to be unnecessary in a Milchemet Mitzvah. Okay, I think that's it for Maimonides' text. So we've had a fast run through. Now, notably, when discussing Maimonides' views, contemporary scholars often point to Nachmanides as putting forth a contrasting perspective. In his additions to Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot, Nachmanides states that the Urim and Tumim must be consulted in order, quote, for the king or the judge or whoever has authority over the nation to lead them out to combat in a permitted or commanded war, Milchemet Reshut o Mitzvah. Moreover, in connection with Numbers 27:21, he sees this obligation as first arising with Joshua as the first ruler, HaMoshel HaRishon, and as thereafter being applicable to all the judges and the kings through the generations. In other words, Nachmanides is explicit about the Urim and Tumim being required for all Israel's wars, encompassing both Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut. However, in putting forth this view, does Nachmanides see himself as disagreeing with Maimonides' position? Or does he simply see himself as stating something as an explicit obligation, which was not stated explicitly by Maimonides, but which would not stand in contradiction with Maimonides' views? Many contemporary scholars have assumed the former, that Nachmanides' insistence on the necessity of Urim and Tumim in Milchemet Mitzvah represented a disagreement with Maimonides, who held that they were not necessary for Milchemet Mitzvah. However, in light of the foregoing discussion and examination of Maimonides' texts, it may in fact be the case that Nachmanides did not see himself as disagreeing in substance with Maimonides, but simply as emphasizing that the consultation of the Urim and Tumim ought to be explicitly included in the enumeration of the commandments. Finally, in assessing Maimonides' halachic stance in this regard, we should also consider whether the reading that I've posited could be compatible with Maimonides' broader conceptual philosophical views. At first glance, it could appear that Maimonides, as a philosophical thinker, generally disinclined to supernatural or miraculous understandings of Judaism and halakha, would be disinclined to affirm the notion of oracular consultation for war. However, in his philosophical treatment of Judaism, in his Guide of the Perplexed, he actually includes consultation of the Urim and Tumim via the Holy Spirit as part of his discussion of different degrees of prophecy. And he explicitly references Bavli Yoma 73b, a passage which discusses the priestly consultation of the Urim and Tumim for warfare authorization. So he doesn't seem to be avoiding this. And so while Maimonides' general understanding of the meaning of the Holy Spirit and of prophecy may itself be influenced by Aristotelian philosophical conceptions of connection to the agent intellect, he nevertheless appears to understand the practice of consultation of the Urim and Tumim as a legitimate part of that broader framework. Moreover, according to Maimonides, in the same passage quoted there, this second degree of prophecy, in connection with which he talks about consultation of the Urim and Thummim, he says that this consists in, quote, the fact that an individual finds that a certain thing has descended upon him, and that another force has come upon him and made him to speak, so that he talks in wise sayings, in words of praise, in useful admonitory dicta, or concerning governmental or divine matters, all this while he is awake and his senses function as usual. And so consultation of the Urim and Thummim via the Holy Spirit in connection with decisions about warfare would seem to fit very well with this description of governmental and divine matters. And it's notable in this regard that Chaim Kreisel has argued in his book on prophecy that while Maimonides treats the Holy Spirit as sub-prophetic, this seems to be primarily in the context of wanting to potentially deny that the priests have prophecy, but at the same time Maimonides still seems to assign the Urim and Thummim with the quality of divine oracular transmission, even if it doesn't transfer the status of prophet to the wearers of the Urim and Thummim. So even in this regard, he seems to still uphold the consultatory role of the Urim and Thummim, even with his more naturalized view of prophecy. And it's notable here that Maimonides' account of divine providence, I don't have time to go into this that much, but his view of providence as expressed in the Guide of the Perplexed can also be compatible with the idea of requiring consultation of the Urim and Thummim. So in Guide 317, when he discusses an example of a ship that sinks at sea, so that those who are on the ship are drowned, Maimonides states that while the sinking of the ship is due to pure chance, he says, quote, the fact that the people in the ship went on board is, according to our opinion, not due to chance, but to divine will in accordance with the deserts of these people as determined in God's judgments, the rule of which cannot be attained by our intellects. So, however, although we may not be able to intellectually discern the specific rule that differentiates those who decided to go on board the ship and were drowned from those whose decisions led them to avoid boarding the ship and so were not drowned, still Maimonides also indicates that the individuals who are making the decision in their life will be guided by providence to the degree that they are connected to the overflow of the agent intellect. So he says, everyone with whom something of this overflow is united will be reached by providence to the extent that he is united with the intellect. So if we take this account, it's to the extent that the priest consulting the Urim and Thummim via the Holy Spirit is connected to the agent intellect, or at least receives something from that, and is thus aligned with God's providential judgment, the priest can be impelled when consulting about whether to go to war or not. The priest can be compelled by a prophetic or sub-prophetic impulse in either an affirmative or a negative direction in terms of the response. So as such, not only would Maimonides' supposedly philosophical views not stand in contradiction with the halachic requirement of the Urim and Thummim in warfare, but his emphasis on divine providence can even be seen as reinforcing the need for such practices of seeking guidance, even if he would have to understand the source of the divine guidance as an overflow from the agent intellect. And we can see also in Kreisel's book on prophecy, you see in later thinkers, for instance, that Crescus also emphasizes certain naturalistic elements in consultation of the Urim and Thummim, while still affirming their use. So the question of how you account for where the message comes from, you could account for that in natural terms, while still maintaining that the practice of consultation needs to occur. So that the supernaturalness doesn't affect the practice question, is the claim. Taken as a whole, Maimonides' writings seem fully compatible with the position that the Urim and Thummim are needed for all wars, both Milchemet Reshut and Milchemet Mitzvah. He certainly never states that the Urim and Thummim are needed only for Milchemet Reshut, not for Milchemet Mitzvah. And in this context, he also never states that a war to deliver Israel from an enemy that attacks them, as a subset of Milchemet Mitzvah, can be engaged in without consultation of the Urim and Thummim. To be sure, it could still be theoretically and textually possible to read Maimonides as putting forth the notion that defensive wars do not require authorization via the Urim and Thummim, but there do not appear to be strong prima facie reasons for viewing this as the most plausible construal of his position. So so this is the textual analysis. We can discuss that. So what I want to argue now, in order to shed greater light on the issue, is to turn to the text of classical rabbinic literature to see what precedent there might be there. So if we hold Maimonides somewhat in suspension, how we read his text, and we turn to classical rabbinic literature and see what is said there, then we can turn back to Maimonides to have a sense of the traditions he may have been drawing on, either critically or affirmatively. So, so we can say that even if we were to posit that Maimonides holds the view that defensive wars can be engaged in without divine authorization, we have seen that Nachmanides insists on the need for divine authorization in all wars. So thus the question is, what indications, if any, are there in classical rabbinic literature for this notion of warfare without direct divine authorization? If there are indications of the latter, this could increase the plausibility that Maimonides can be understood as likewise inheriting and putting forth such a notion. By contrast, if classical rabbinic literature appears not to contain this notion, this would then increase the plausibility of reading Maimonides as in keeping with Nachmanides in this regard, as we've indicated earlier. So let's turn, so to make an assertion about all of classical rabbinic literature in the remaining, how much time do I have? 15 minutes?
20.
20? 20, okay, that should be okay. So this is, clearly, I hope that I'm including the relevant passages, but I'm doing my best. So we'll see what happens. So let's, in looking back at the Mishnah to start with, let's examine the question of the difference between Milchemet Reshut and Milchemet Mitzvah. Mishnah Sanhedrin states that they may not lead the king out, not lead the people out to a Milchemet Reshut, except by the order of the court of 71. So right here, Al Pi Beit Din Shel Shivim V'Echad. And Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:4 likewise affirms, in discussion of the king, he leads the people to Milchemet Reshut by the order of the court of 71. So here, in emphasizing the need for the Sanhedrin's approval for Milchemet Reshut, the Mishnah appears to be emphasizing that, by contrast, Milchemet Mitzvah does not require the Sanhedrin's approval. So that, even though it doesn't say that, we can say they're stating it about Milchemet Reshut in order to imply that Milchemet Mitzvah doesn't need the Sanhedrin's approval. However, the Mishnah does not mention the Urim and Tumim as a factor that differentiates Milchemet Reshut from Milchemet Mitzvah. And so, given the general portrayal of the Urim and Tumim in connection with warfare more generally, it seems plausible to assume an underlying view in which the Urim and Tumim are seen as needed for both categories of war. Likewise, subsequent discussion in the Talmud of the use of the Urim and Tumim repeatedly draws upon Numbers 27:21, thus indicating a general assumption of the Urim and Tumim as a core component of warfare from the Milchemet Mitzvah of Joshua onward. So we certainly do not find any indication in such discussions that Milchemet Mitzvah would not require the Urim and Tumim. Now, it is possible that someone could say, yes, in the wars of Joshua involved the use of Urim and Tumim, but this only shows that the requirement occurs to some subcategories within Milchemet Mitzvah. The wars of Joshua were wars of conquest, not wars of defense. And so it could be the case that the Urim and Tumim are perhaps necessary for conquest forms of Milchemet Mitzvah, but not for defensive forms of Milchemet Mitzvah. So that's a possibility. So thus, we should specifically examine classical rabbinic literature passages that appear akin to Maimonides' notion of delivering Israel from an enemy that attacks them, and see what is said there. So one relevant place is the discussion in Mishnah Sota 8:7, alongside discussions of the passage in the Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds. So the passages of Mishnah Sota chapter 8, in chapter 8, before we get to Mishnah 7 within this chapter, the first 6 Mishnahs in that chapter discuss the various exemptions from military service that are granted to those who have recently built a house, planted a vineyard, or betrothed a wife, and to those who are fearful and faint-hearted. So interpreting here Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 5 through 8. And after going through these, who can be exempted from a war, Mishnah Sota 8:7 then reads, when is this the case? in the case of Milchemet Rashut. But in the case of Milchemet Mitzvah, all must go forth, even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her bridal chamber. So quoting Joel 2:16 there. And then Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and said, when is this the case? In the case of Milchemet Mitzvah. But in the case of Milchemet Chovah, all must go forth, even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her bridal chamber. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details of how to understand the potential differences between Milchemet Mitzvah, Milchemet Rashut, Milchemet Chovah. There's much has been written about this, but and these are carried on in the Talmudic discussions, and obviously later. But the relevant point for our purposes is that there's a distinction being made between one type of war, in which people can be exempted from military service, and another type of war in which all Israelites must go forth to battle without the typical exemptions. However, we can note that in the discussion of the exemptions versus full service, this does not itself indicate anything about whether the Urim and Tumim would be required only in certain types of wars, but not in others. It's more just about the question of who serves in the battle. Then in the Palestinian Babylonian Talmuds, various ideas are put forth to explain the Mishnah, some of which could potentially sound like wars of defense. Thus, in the Palestinian Talmud, which I do not have here, so you can listen and look it up, but Rabbi Hista puts forth the idea that, according to Rabbi Judah in the Mishnah, the idea that a Milchemet Rashut is when we go out against them. Milchemet Chovah is when they come against us. So this latter type, a war which Israel fights, but which is initiated by others coming against us, could plausibly be described as a defensive war. So that's one instance. And in the Babylonian Talmud, Rava sees the dispute in the Mishnah as involving the question of wars fought, quote, to diminish the idol worshippers so that they would not come against Israel. Here, this category of war could also fall under the Maimonidean category of delivering Israel from an enemy that comes against them. Although in this case, it might be better described as preemptive war rather than defensive war, but it's still in that same general area. Yet, in both the Palestinian and the Babylonian versions, the focus of the discussion of different types of wars is framed entirely in terms of the question of exemption from battle, and not in connection with the requirement or non-requirement of the Urim and Tumim. Thus, given that in classical rabbinic literature appears generally to treat the Urim and Tumim as required for all forms of warfare, there's nothing in these passages to indicate that authorization by the Urim and Tumim would not also be required even in cases in which a bride and bridegroom must go out from their marriage chamber. So a war can thus be fully defensive and yet still require the Urim and Tumim. And now, sort of to get more at the conceptuality, we'll look at some more agadic passages, but in connection with these halakhic terms, because part of the question is, what is the rabbinic conception of the Urim and Tumim and more? We see these particular legal statements, but how do they generally understand these oracles and practices, etc.? So in this passage, which is in your handout, this is a passage describing the it's actually the second one. We're looking at Eruvin 45a. In discussing the permissibility of fighting on Shabbat, the Babylonian Talmud discusses the narrative described in 1 Samuel 23, 1 through 2, in which it says, quote, David was told, the Philistines are raiding Keilah, Nilchamim b'Keilah, and plundering the threshing floors. David consulted the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go, attack the Philistines and you will save Keilah. The Talmud, here as elsewhere, understands David's phrase of consulting the Lord as a reference to the employment of the Urim and Tumim. So there's multiple passages where they look at the phrasing of what is Sha'al. Where is it? David. Yeah. So and so they understand this in general as consultation of the Urim and Tumim. And so in this case, we have what is clearly a defensive military action on the border town of Keilah, in which David, before going to battle, consults the Urim and Tumim. And the Talmud then helps us out. It goes on to clarify the specific purpose of the consultation of the Urim and Thummim here. David did not ask whether it was legally forbidden or permitted to engage in battle, since, and the Talmud says, if this was what he wanted to know, the Beit Din of Shmuel the Ramathite was then in existence. Rather, David inquired, quote, whether he would be successful or whether he would not be successful. So the bolded part there in that passage. So in other words, the Talmud seems to be saying that if David had a question about legal permissibility, he could have consulted the scholars at the Beit Din. Instead, the Urim and Thummim were to be consulted in order to determine whether going to battle was in accord with God's will at that particular moment. Since in the rabbinic understanding, God is the one who determines victory or defeat in battle, it was necessary to consult the Urim and Thummim to determine whether God indeed willed that Israel should go to war at that moment, in which case David's efforts would be successful, or whether it was not God's will that Israel should go to war at that moment, in which case David should not go to battle, since if he did so, he would not be successful. In this case, God indicates his will that David should indeed go to battle, and in doing so, God will bring it about that David will save Keilah from the Philistines who have attacked. Thus, in the Talmud's portrayal, David does not consult a Beit Din, does not consult the Sanhedrin, which thus parallels Maimonides' definition of Milchemet Mitzvah as defensive. But he does nevertheless consult the Urim and Thummim in order to deliver Israel from an enemy that attacks them. Thus, the consultation with the Sanhedrin involves the question of human legal authorization, which may not be necessary in this form of defensive war, but the consultation with the Urim and Thummim involves the question of divine authorization, of whether the decision to fight in this moment accords with God's will. And this type of authorization, in the rabbinic understanding, would appear necessary for all forms of war. So I have just a couple more examples. Do we have a little bit of time? Yeah, okay, so good. So a similar theopolitical understanding can be found in the Palestinian Talmud, where Rabbi Pinchas and Rabbi Jeremiah, in the name of Rabbi Chia Barba, interpret the phrase from Numbers 27:21. Again, so the same, we've heard that verse again. What does it mean by, they say here, this is at the bottom of page 5, he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. And so the Talmud comments, by the order of the Urim, Beseder HaUrim, is not written here, but rather by the judgment of the Urim, B'mishpat HaUrim. This teaches that in the time that Israel goes out to war, the court on high sits in judgment over them to decide whether they will be victorious or whether they will be defeated. So in the portrayal here, the specific scriptural formulation of the mishpat highlights the fact that the heavenly court sits in judgment, mishpat, to decide what the outcome of Israel's battle is going to be, namely victory or defeat. It is for this reason that consultation of the Urim and Thummim is crucial. It enables Israel to determine the divine will ahead of time. Thus, in determining whether to go out to battle, the priest asks via the Urim and Thummim, will Israel be victorious or not? If he receives an affirmative response, he knows that Israel has been destined from above for victory, and so Israel should indeed go out to battle. However, if in his consultation he does not receive an affirmative response, this constitutes a warning that Israel, in this particular moment, should not go out to battle, since victory has not been decreed for them. And again, we can note that the description here is of Israel consulting the Urim and Thummim prior to going out to war in a general sense in this passage, not limited to any one subcategory of war. Moreover, and this I think is a very evocative passage, so this is from Bava Kama in the Bavli. The Babylonian Talmud explicitly thematizes the inappropriateness of even Moses, Israel's greatest prophet, the inappropriate of even Moses to make judgments to go to war without God's direct authorization. In this, the Talmud may be building upon biblical condemnations of Israel's initiatives to go to war without God's authorization, such as in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 26 and 41 through 44, in which Israel is criticized for not going to war when God commanded it, but also for going to war when God did not command it. and all of this in the context of commanded wars against the Canaanites. So that's the background here. And in this passage, we have it's an interpretation of a scriptural verse. Scripture says, "And the Lord said to me, Moses, do not harass Moab, and do not contend with them in war." So in the scriptural verse says milchama, so it's triggering that category. And then the Talmud asks, but would it have entered into Moses' mind to wage war without authorization? So la'asot milchama shelo bereshut? And then it responds, rather, we must assume that this verse is indicating that Moses had employed kal vachomer reasoning on his own, be'atzmo. And Moses has said to himself, if with regard to the Midianites, who came only to help the Moabites, the Torah said, harass the Midianites and smite them, how much more with regard to the Moabites themselves? That was what Moses had reasoned. But then the comment says, but the Holy One, blessed be He, said to him, that which has arisen in your mind is not what has arisen in my mind. I have 2 good doves to bring forth from them, Ruth the Moabitess and Naamah the Ammonitess. So here, Moses initially thinks that a decision to go to war can be decided by extrapolation, via merely human judgment from a previous instance in which God directly commanded going to war. Because God previously commanded going to war against the Midianites, and because in the Talmud's portrayal, the Midianites were merely aiding the Moabites, then it would stand to reason that going to war against the Moabites would obviously be in accord with God's wishes. In other words, Moses does not think he is going to war without authorization. Rather, he thinks that the necessary authorization can be obtained via logical reasoning from previous instances of God's direct authorization. Moreover, since the war against the Midianites is presented in language of self-defense, since Numbers 25:17 through 18 indicated that Israel should harass the Midianites and smite them because they harass you. Thus, if there God commanded a defensive war against the Midianites, it stands to reason that Moses can confidently go to war in a similarly defensive manner against the Moabites. Yet, God rebukes Moses and informs him that Moses' human reasoning is not the same as God's reasoning, because in the future, God plans to bring forth from the Moabites the crucial personage of Ruth, the progenitor of the Davidic line, and also plans to bring forth Naamah from out of the Ammonites, who was to be the future wife of King Solomon. Thus, while engaging in a war of defense against the Moabites might appear obvious on a human level, it is not in accord with God's will at that moment, and thus God has to step in and prevent Moses' autonomous action. In this account, the Talmud can be seen as emphasizing the idea that, in the context of decisions to go to war, even what seems like an obviously legitimate or even necessary instance of defensive war cannot legitimately be initiated without God's direct authorization. If even Moses could not do so, how much more are the subsequent human leaders not in a position to initiate war without such direct authorization from God? Again, the issue here is not about the legal justification, legal or halachic justification. Well, it could be halachic. Let's say it's not about the legal justification for defensive war, but rather the fact that God sometimes wills that Israel should go to war, and sometimes wills that they should not go to war. And these divine willings do not necessarily accord with what human judgment would conclude in the same situation. Therefore, in the absence of indication of God's positive will, via prophetic reception of command in the case of Moses, or via the Urim and Tumim in the case of Joshua and subsequent generations, Israel is to refrain from going to war, la'asot milchama, in the language of the Talmud. So there seems to be a conception in the classical rabbinic literature that human judgment on its own, without explicit divine confirmation, simply is not enough to properly authorize the decision to engage in war. In putting forth this way of thinking, the Talmud may be challenging normal understandings of war and human initiative, even normal according to the ancient Near Eastern or Greco-Roman culture of the time. Normal understandings according to which a nation can and ought to defend its collective political structure and interests in case of attack by an opposing group. By contrast, the Talmud's understanding here may be drawn from biblical streams of theological thought, according to which God sometimes wills that Israel should fight against and defeat its enemies, but in other cases, God wills that Israel's enemies should fight against and defeat Israel. So thus, in Isaiah 10:5, God is presented as designating Assyria as the rod of my anger in Assyria's military attack against the northern kingdom of Israel. Likewise, when the Babylonians attack the southern kingdom of Judah, Jeremiah asserts that those who resist Babylon militarily, i.e. in what would be a defensive war, are going against God's will. Rather, those who seek to align themselves with God should submit to their Babylonian attackers, for God wills that the kingdom of Judah is to be overthrown. Thus, in the rabbinic understanding, because God sometimes wills military resistance, and sometimes does not, consultation of the Urim and Thummim is necessary in any given instance of potential military engagement to determine whether God desires Israel to fight or refrain from fighting, even in cases involving an otherwise commendable motivation of delivering Israel from an enemy that comes against them. According to this conceptual framework, in the absence of the active oracle of the Urim and Thummim, as was the case in the rabbinic understanding following the destruction of the first temple, Israel, in their conception, is not in a position to go to war at all. As David S. Shapiro put it in his seminal study from 1934. So this is actually one of the first scholarly articles on views of war in rabbinic Judaism. From 1934, he wrote, according to this, Israel can no longer wage wars, for its war-declaring agencies are no longer in operation. So that has not been written mostly since then, but that, at least in 1934, that was seemed to be his view. Okay, so just to conclude then, while the efforts of conceptual analysis, especially of a corpus like that of classical rabbinic literature, cannot produce absolutely definitive results, it nevertheless seems to be the case that the texts of classical rabbinic literature contain a strikingly uniform and consistent view, wherein all instances of warfare, whether defensive, preemptive, commanded, obligatory, or permitted, require direct divine authorization in order for Israel to legitimately go out to battle. And so there may be conceptions in rabbinic literature of certain types of violence that don't require God's authorization and can be engaged in by human beings on their own. For instance, of the thief breaking in. So this would be an instance of violence or killing that doesn't require the Urim and Thummim. But it seems that it may be that the political collective nature of warfare, alongside the forms of death and killing and sacrifice that it involves, may be understood by classical rabbinic literature as requiring special and explicit authorization from God, whose thought in this regard is often counterintuitive and unlike human thought and intuitions. While this theological or theopolitical stance may mean that classical rabbinic conceptuality differs strikingly from much modern and contemporary understandings of warfare and collective human agency, this does nevertheless seem to be the conclusion to be drawn from analysis of the textual, historical, literary data available to us. So now, revisiting Maimonides in conclusion. So if classical rabbinic literature therefore consistently rejects the notion of wars on the basis of merely human judgment, how does this affect our attempts at understanding Maimonides' position? As we saw above, while many scholarly accounts today assume that Maimonides does affirm the idea of wars without direct divine authorization, closer analysis of Maimonides' text calls this assumption into question at the least. While a level of ambiguity remains in certain regards, an understanding of Maimonides, in which the Urim and Thummim are required for both Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, seem to fit the textual evidence at least as closely, if not more closely, than an understanding of Maimonides in which the Urim and Thummim are not required for Milchemet Mitzvah. Moreover, we saw that Nachmanides explicitly asserts the necessity of Urim and Thummim for both categories of war, and thus appears to be in keeping with the theopolitical conceptuality of classical rabbinic literature. Thus, if we posit that Maimonides differs from Nachmanides in this regard, this would mean that Maimonides' stance constitutes a major departure from classical rabbinic conceptuality. While this is certainly theoretically possible, Maimonides himself does not provide any explicit indication of such a break. That is, there is no explicit statement of the sort, the Urim and Thummim are not required for Milchemet Mitzvah. As such, given the absence of evidence to the contrary, it seems entirely plausible to read Maimonides as preserving the basic classical rabbinic stance, wherein authorization from the Urim and Thummim is necessary for all forms of Israel's warfare. However, if such an understanding of Maimonides is indeed plausible, this then raises the question of why contemporary scholars, ostensibly engaging in academic historical investigations of Maimonides' thought, have so broadly tended to assume that Maimonides does think in terms of warfare without divine authorization. So I think this is my real question, that regardless of what we debate about Maimonides, why hasn't it been raised more in the scholarly literature is the question. Why has this been so frequently asserted if Maimonides himself never explicitly indicates such a view? So while a full assessment of the causes of this scholarly pattern is beyond the scope of the presentation, it might be that modern notions of warfare, in which warfare on the basis of merely human judgment without direct divine authorization is the norm, this may have led scholars incorrectly to project contemporary assumptions back onto Maimonides. While Maimonides plays a prominent normative role in contemporary religious Judaism, such that support for Maimonides would be desirable for contemporary attempts to discuss justification for warfare, this would be, scholarly speak, a separate matter from the question of Maimonides' own views, considered from a historical perspective. It may in fact be the case that Maimonides, in keeping with classical rabbinic conceptuality before him, and Nachmanides after him, simply retained and affirmed the notion that direct divine authorization is necessary for legitimately engaging in warfare, and that defensive wars are no exception. The integration of such considerations into scholarship on Maimonides and warfare, as well as on warfare and rabbinic Judaism more broadly, would thus serve to correct prominent historical potential misconstruals that are currently more widespread in scholarly literature. Thank you.